Hello class, welcome to our very first lecture for the online section of Environment Society. I am excited to be doing this course with you, and hopefully you'll enjoy following along with us as we learn together. If you have not yet watched the welcome video, please make sure you go back and watch the welcome video. I would suggest even before continuing on with this one. Or at the very least, just afterwards. So in the welcome video, I'm going to talk over the syllabus, all of the things that you need to know and expect in the course, how the course is going to function and work on a regular basis. So there's some really critically important information in there that you're going to need, especially since we aren't meeting face-to-face in a classroom to succeed in this course. So then our first unit here, first 3 class sessions are focused on kind of giving this broad overview of kind of laying the groundwork for understanding, first of all, what is environmental studies and how this whole thing of environment, society, and how the human world and the natural world are intersecting in this unique moment in human history, what that looks like, and how we can really approach that in a way of understanding the ways that human systems influence natural systems around us and vice versa. So let's jump in and get started here. One of the things that I'm going to do regularly with you, and this is my way of checking up to make sure that you are watching these recordings, is each lecture is going to have several questions that I want you to actually respond to. So I need you to actually create a document here, a Word document or some other document, and write down your answers to these. So though typically about 5 to 10 response questions that I will ask. So in a normal classroom environment, this is where I would pause, ask the class a question, gather feedback from the class. So this is just a way of getting a little bit of feedback from you so I can hear what you're reflecting on and holding you accountable to make sure you're actually watching the lectures, which is critically important. So make sure that each time I come to a question, and you'll notice that it will have a cue here. So Q1, the next one, which comes on the next slide, will have Q2, and it'll ask a question. And I just want you to write down a quick answer. You don't need to spend a long time. I'm not looking for an essay, not even looking for a paragraph, a couple bullet points, a sentence, whatever. So the idea being, when you get to a slide that's got a Q on it, pause the video, answer the question, and then restart the video after you answer the question. So that should be how we should roll on that. Let me know if you have questions. So first one, solving environmental challenges relies on our ability to what? Is it A, create change by influencing the attitudes and behaviors of individuals, or B, transform social institutions such as corporations and governments? Which do you think is more important in solving environmental challenges today? Okay, hopefully by now you've paused, responded to that in your document, and ready to move on. So of course, there is no easy answer to this question. This is not a yes, A is correct and B is incorrect. I probably should have put the A and B on there if I'm going to reference A and B. Obviously, we have to, one of the fundamental ways of influencing change, of solving environmental challenges, is going to be to change people. We have to change attitudes. We have to change behaviors. We have to influence the ways that people act in order to solve problems. Unfortunately, influencing the way that people act is not going to be enough. If there are not significant incentives for people to change. So many people simply aren't going to change. There's a lot of people you're never going to convince to recycle, for example, or that you're never going to convince that climate change is real. So these are simple realities of things. And there's a lot of people who do think climate change is real, who do think recycling is important, who are concerned about environmental problems, and yet the systems or structures aren't in place for them to make a big difference. Maybe they live far from public transportation, so they don't have an option for public transportation. Maybe the only affordable vehicle for them is really energy inefficient. So they have to use a lot of gas to get to their place of work, or for a variety of other reasons. So transforming social institutions, like corporations, like governments, is important as well. Both of these are critical aspects of how we address environmental challenges today. One of the most common, if not the most common, problem, I would say, in this course is the tendency of students to focus only on the first one there, of changing individual behavior change, and to miss the important aspects of changing corporations and governments. We'll hit on more on that in a little bit. Why are we not clicking? Come on. Oh boy, too far. Sorry, my computer's responding too slowly here. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, number 3, what is the environment? So go ahead and pause and answer or respond to that question. What do you think of when you hear environment? What is the environment? Put up a variety of different photos on here that could each in different ways be interpreted as being the environment, an environmental issue, a piece of nature, a piece of the environment around us, the world around us. This is a key question. What is the environment? A lot of times we think of the environment as being the natural world, or the world separate from humans, or maybe the world as God created it, or animals, or wilderness as being the environment. But what about the cities that we live in? Are those part of the environment? Certainly our actions in cities have a big impact upon the rest of the planet. What about the people around us? Are they part of our environment? What about the things that we have made? Infrastructure, buildings, bridges, are those part of the environment? A key piece of this is really thinking more broadly about what is the environment, because all actions of human society have an impact on the planet. It's a simple reality of the way that we live today, and not just today, throughout human history. But of course, today there are many more of us on the planet making a bigger impact, and so we see that more readily. So are humans part of the environment? I would suggest that an adequate discussion of what is the environment needs to be bigger than just how we have traditionally looked at it in terms of being separate from humans. Okay, make a list of some environmental issues that are considered environmental issues. So just list 3 or 4 of those, but go ahead and pause it and list a few of them out. So lots of examples that you could have come up with there: pollution, air pollution, water pollution, species loss, extinctions, deforestation, climate change, the ozone layer problem, ocean acidification, sea level rise, all kinds of environmental challenges, toxic waste, landfills filling up. There's all kinds of different things, water pollution, freshwater access, all kinds of things that could be considered environmental issues. And we're going to try to look at those broadly in this course, and particularly the different ways that human society interacts with them. The famous sort of forefather of the environmental movement often is considered to be John Muir. John Muir is the founder of the Sierra Club, very influential thinker at the beginning of the 20th century, and sort of is the one who got Yosemite to become a national park. And one of his quotes that I really like is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Now, if you were here with me in person, I'd ask you, what do you think he means by that? But I think that's a really insightful quote. And we see that in a lot of ways, basically saying our actions have consequences. Our regular, everyday, normal actions have consequences beyond just the immediate area around us, beyond just our normal way of life. So when we choose to turn on the lights, that's calling for power, electrical power. That power comes from somewhere. It requires some sort of fuel to be used, or energy source to be used, in order to provide that electrical power. And that has consequences in multiple places, where the electric power generating station is, where if that comes from a fossil fuel, where that's being dug out of the ground, that's coming from renewable energy, then where the renewable energy is put up. If we drive to the store versus walk to the store, or if we walk to the store instead of driving, that has a consequence. It has an influence, an impact. It's hitched to whether or not air pollution takes place around us. It might seem that our contribution towards that is small, but those things add up. What we choose to eat has an impact. Where we choose to eat it, in what way, whether we recycle or not. If we are the sum of our decisions, as some would say, then society is the sum of each individual's decisions. So even if it seems like my influence on the world is negligible compared to the rest of the world, well, when 7 billion people think like that, we get ourselves in the situation where we see today. So it's all connected, it's all hooked in together. One interesting example would be when we eliminated wolves from Yellowstone National Park. So wolves have been reintroduced since, But when we eliminated them, what we found was that eliminating wolves greatly increased the population of elk in the park. Obviously, wolves prey on elk. Without wolves, there were a lot more elk. As the elk population soared, we found that there was a lot of decreased aspen growing, particularly along stream beds. And so we had eroding streams and widening streams because the elk were eating up the aspen shoots as they would come up. This in turn resulted in these rivers and streams in the park warming, which changed fish populations, decreased habitat for small animals and other things. So you see how just one species, taking one species out of an ecosystem, had all these cascading results on many others. And we see that regularly in our planet, that things are connected together. They don't happen in isolation, but when one thing is impacted, many other things end up being influenced by that change as well. And historically, environmental problems tended to be things that happened to people. So a flood would happen. And the environmental problem was that the flood would flood a village, people would be killed in the flood, crops would be damaged, the village would have to recover from that, and that was the environmental problem, something that the environment did to people. Floods, droughts, famines, plagues, these were environmental problems historically. Now, when we talk about environmental problems, we usually are talking about something different. We're talking about something that humans are doing to the environment, which in turn hurts humans also. So today's environmental problems tend to be caused by humans: air pollution, toxic pollution, ocean plastics, changes in the atmosphere. These are environmental problems that we see today, and they're things that humans have done to the environment, but then that environmental change that we see from that in turn hurts humans. So just like the environmental problems of old, where humans are being impacted by natural disasters, we are now causing or contributing toward or exacerbating natural disasters on our own, which in turn further affect humans from that. So environmental problems, interestingly, from a historical perspective, have been seen as kind of different things, but now they tend to be much more thought of as things that humans are doing that are then in turn hurting us. I want to focus on three key dichotomies here that help us sort of understand the sort of broad scope of some of the things we're going to talk about. I want to talk about problems and solutions, individuals and society, and attitudes and behaviors. I think these kind of help frame some bigger picture things that are important to consider as we work through this course. So first of all, problems versus solutions. So the book opens with a discussion about how we tend to frame environmental issues as either problems or solutions, and claiming that we tend to talk a lot more about the problems than we do the solution. So here's my question for you. Why do you think we tend to focus more on environmental problems than solutions in our public discourse about things? Like in the news, you hear more about environmental problems than you hear about environmental solutions, right? So why do you think that's the case? I think there's a lot of different reasons that you could use to try to explain this is, and this gets into a whole lot of really interesting sort of sociology and psychology of how we look at the challenges around us. But I think a lot of it goes to the fact that these problems are much more in our face now than they used to be. It used to be that environmental problems were fairly small scale as human population was a lot smaller. We were a lot more spread out. Now, with people a lot more concentrated in cities, a lot more people around, using a whole lot more energy, the problems are much more significant than they have been in the past. And that combined with sort of the ways that we have socioculturally resisted some changes that perhaps are necessary to do in order to address these problems have made it difficult for us to really approach that. I've tried in the past to try to separate out problem solution in terms of how I frame this course, and it just doesn't work that way. It's too interwoven in. So what you're going to see in this course is we're going to weave through that. We're going to wind back around problem, solution, and kind of weaving around in a roundabout way. Sometimes one lecture might be focused more on problems, another one might be more on solutions, another one might weave in problems and solutions together. There's not a consistent way of how it's organized because it's just really difficult to do that. Same thing topically. So many of these issues sort of feed into each other that it becomes challenging to separate them out topically. We'll do our best for that. Your book points out that the question of what's happening in the world is a natural science question. So the rising temperature on the earth, the rising extinction rate, plastic pollution, these are science-based questions, natural science questions. And these tend to be pretty depressing because there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world. And that can be challenging. But the question of why they're happening and how they're happening and how we can resolve them, these are social science questions. These are questions that get to human behavior, that get to policy, that get to economics. And those are actually a lot more hopeful because that's where the solutions rely. We know natural science can tell us what needs to be done, but it can't tell us how or whether we are likely to do that. Social science can tell us how to solve them and whether or not it's achievable. And that's, I think, where sort of the hope plays into it. Okay, second one, let's talk about individual versus society. I made this comment earlier on, but let me ask you the question, what's the problem with focusing too heavily on individuals as the answer? So I've said this many times. I think I haven't said this many times yet because you just started this course. I say this a lot. It's a big problem when we focus solely on individuals as the solution. So when you write a test question for me, don't put the question just in terms of how, if the question asks, how are we going to solve this problem? Don't focus on specifically on what individuals can do. Mention that, that's helpful. But if your answer is solely focused on what an individual alone can do, that's going to miss the bigger solutions to that. Individuals alone are not able to solve the kinds of global challenges that we see on facing our planet today. For one thing, in order for people to make a greener choice, they have to have viable green choices to choose from. And that's just not the case a lot of the times. A lot of places, our society has not shifted to accommodate that yet. Think of public transportation in the United States, or think of the sociocultural barriers to changing what we eat. Those can be really difficult to accomplish or accommodate. Or think of your energy supply that's available to you. Many places you live, there's just no choice for where you get your energy from. It comes from the grid, and if you live in West Virginia, that grid is from coal. So those solutions are not always available to us. We have to change things on a more structural level. That's not to say that individual actions are not important, because they critically are important for building movements, for changing society, for aligning our actions with our values in a way that that moves towards solutions and involves our own lives in moving towards solutions. But we can't over-focus on the individual. Let's skip that question. What role do individuals play in making society more sustainable? Because I think we've already talked some about that, but the basic idea that humans are involved in finding solutions, that individuals have to act out of their value systems in a way that aligns their action with their values and moves towards solutions, but the solutions always have to be bigger than just what individuals alone can do. Okay, third one, attitude versus behaviors. Unfortunately, and you see this in the reading, we find that simply changing people's attitudes doesn't always change their behaviors. So for example, I want you to list an action that you take regularly that is bad for the environment. All right, hopefully you've come up, maybe put one or two more down there, because I think you could come up with more. So I drive a minivan. We actually own an electric car, but my wife drives it to work because she has a longer commute than I do. Normally I walk to work, and that's when I feel good about my green self. Sometimes I drive to work. Maybe I got up late. Maybe I have to go from work to a meeting somewhere else. Maybe I have to bring something heavy to campus, and I drive a really energy inefficient minivan to do that. I love cheeseburgers. Beef particular is really bad for the environment, so I don't eat it very much, but I do every once in a while splurge and eat a cheeseburger because it's just so dang yummy. But that's bad for the environment. So we all have things, and I am highly motivated, right? So if even I sometimes fly on vacation, not a lot. It's not like I'm a jet setting, traveling everywhere. I don't have the money for that, but I do sometimes fly on vacation with my family. Where was I going? Yes, so no matter how motivated we are in our attitudes, often the behavior doesn't match. And that's a key challenge to realize as well, that we need to change attitudes, we need to change belief systems, but it's not enough because it doesn't always lead to that, especially if the infrastructure isn't in place. If you don't have recycling bins at the college you go to, we do fortunately here at Houghton everywhere, but if your building doesn't have recycling bins, how can you recycle? If the electric vehicle charging infrastructure isn't in place in the city you live in, owning an electric vehicle isn't yet an option for you. Fortunately, that's changing quickly too. But if the infrastructure is not in place, it's not going to happen. If the sociocultural barriers are significant, it's going to be tough to overcome that as well. So attitudes, behaviors. Once again, I got ahead of myself. Why don't we do these? All kinds of reasons. Why don't you write down one reason that you think of why you don't do, or whatever that bad behavior is for the environment. Why do you think it is that you eat it? For me, like, okay, let's pick on eating cheeseburgers. I have succeeded at significantly cutting back my meat consumption, especially beef consumption, but I just can't go no cheeseburgers. The thought of going the rest of my life without a cheeseburger, I just can't do it. So my solution has been to cut down a lot, but not entirely. It's also important to realize that there's a lot of technological momentum at play to changing society. It's difficult to change once technology becomes embedded in society. So for example, here's a question. What are the barriers to the US having a good public transportation system? What do you think? What are the challenges that are out there? Why do we not have a good public transportation system in the US? Now you can oppose that with, where do they have good public transportation systems? Some of you perhaps have traveled to places that do have good public transportation systems. This is actually in Moscow. This is the metro in Moscow. Moscow has a fantastic public transportation system, underappreciated. A lot of people look to London or Paris or Tokyo for great examples of good public transportation systems. Moscow also has a great one. And many countries around the world have good public transportation systems. And once the infrastructure is in place, it works really well. But if the infrastructure is in place around car travel, as opposed to a subway travel or a bus travel, then it's really hard to change that because the infrastructure sort of feeds into how people operate. If the stores in your area where you would go shopping all have large parking lots and have no public transportation heading to them, or underutilized public transportation that doesn't go to convenient locations or doesn't have convenient times, then it's not going to be used, and that creates challenges for that. So for us, our interstate highway system, parking lots, drive-throughs, the suburbs, cultural pressures, demographic pressures, racial dynamics, all of that plays in to how we use, or more often don't use, public transportation in the United States and create barriers for us in that regard. So what is environmental studies? Environmental studies works at this intersection right here, the intersection between natural systems, the environment, what we tend to think of historically as the environment, the natural world, the world separate from humans, and human systems. So environmental studies looks at that intersection of the Venn diagram right there. How does society interact with the natural world? That intersection here is where we focus on in environmental studies and is the core focus of this course particularly, which is really an introduction to what environmental studies looks like. Two important things I want to really emphasize about the discipline of environmental studies because it helps us understand the issues I think we're going to talk about in this course even better. One is that it's inherently interdisciplinary. There's an inherent interdisciplinary nature to environmental studies and to these questions. So it's not just simply looking at, if you're looking at the situation right here, you see a bunch of cars and a traffic jam. This is not just an ecology question. It is an ecology question because the pollution that comes from those cars impacts the ecosystems that surround that highway. So it does impact ecology, but it's also a technology question. What kinds of alternative forms of transportation are there in play here? Are any of these electric vehicles? Where is the mass transit infrastructure? Why does all of this result in all these cars piled up on the highway? What about psychology? Why do we make the decision to drive versus take a different form of transportation. Human psychology plays into that as well as sociology. What about public health? How are humans impacted by all this air pollution generated by these cars? Studies have shown that housing projects connected next to large highways like these have significantly higher rates of asthma and other cardiorespiratory problems. That's a human health issue. Or political science. How do we regulate this? Do we put in high occupancy vehicle lanes? Do we fund and build new public transportation infrastructure? Are there other ways that we can avoid through regulation this kind of scenario right here? What about economics? How does the gas price play into that? What if we put a price on carbon? How does that play into that? Chemistry. How does the burning of petroleum, how does that relate to global warming? That's a chemistry question. Urban design. How do we design our cities so that doesn't happen? All of these things, as you can see, we just touched on about 10 different fields of study here. All of this plays into this one traffic question. And that's what environmental studies is focused on. How do all these different things intersect together in a cross-disciplinary kind of way? The other thing is there's a lot of incredible complexity to these kinds of questions. So if you look, for example, it's not as simple as studying declining population of orangutan populations in Indonesia. So it's a big problem, a fantastic animal that is on the brink of extinction, largely due to human actions. And if you look at this, it's really complex. So on the surface, it's deforestation that's threatening orangutan populations. But why is that deforestation happening? Well, a lot of it comes from spreading agriculture. Why is agriculture spreading? Well, populations are growing. Indonesia is trying to advance its economy. A lot of the way it's doing that is through palm oil plantations. Palm oil plantations, the easiest way to do that is to deforest an area and put in palm oil plantations. There's big money for doing that. Why is palm oil expanding? Well, the more we change our processed foods, the more we change our food system to include processed foods and shifting towards cheaper forms of food products, the more we're expanding to that. Is there a responsible way to produce palm oil, sustainable way? What does that look like? Is that more expensive? Is that marketable on a global sphere? How can we make sure it's actually responsibly grown or not? What about human rights abuses? What about the people who lived on this land, the indigenous peoples who were pushed off of this land in order to expand that? Or what about the new jobs that are created by expanding palm oil? And are those good jobs and are they paid well? What about political corruption and how that leads into this kind of agricultural expansion going into the quote unquote national parks that are designated that way but are not protected because of corruption? What about ecotourism? Can that be an answer? What does that answer look like? These are kinds of complex issues. You can see it's not as simple as how do we stop deforestation, because it plays into a whole lot of other questions as well. And when you look at environmental studies, it really is a field full of unanswered questions, or perhaps not so much unanswered questions, but questions with really complicated quasi answers that sort of get at it. So that's a big piece of it. I want to shift just a little bit and give a quick overview and talk about some ways that humans have tended to view the environment. And this could be a much longer discussion, but we're going to shorten this to just a few quick reflections on that. Historically, I want to talk briefly about three different perspectives. One way that humans have kind of tended to look at the environment at times has been from an adversarial perspective. The environment or the wilderness is a place of danger. It's a place that is threatening to humans. It is a place that should be avoided or strayed away from. This tended to be a much older perspective. We have sufficiently tamed the natural world now so that it's not as much of a threat or of a danger, but historically when human populations were low, then the wild animal species were a much bigger threat. The wilderness was a much bigger threat to humans. And so there tended to be a more adversarial perspective, particularly coming up with the Industrial Revolution, the colonial era, the spread of humans around the planet, the increase of trade around the planet. It sort of shifted to more of this idea of technological dominance. You can see this exhibited really well from this John Gast painting, which embarrassingly is entitled American Progress. But you can see there's a clear theme here. that the answer, what is American progress? Well, American progress is domination of the natural world, domination of indigenous peoples, pushing things westward, expanding white civilization. So it's very much a white supremacy perspective. It's very much a perspective that elevates humans over the natural world, that elevates people of European descent over everyone else, that subjugates anything that would stand in the way of progress. So this has tended to be, and this technological dominance really continues to today, including with some of that racial undertone that goes with it as well. But this idea that we need to dominate the natural world around us and extract all the resources that we can from it, that mentality is largely still what drives the global economy. Even if people wouldn't look to that and say, acknowledge that, yes, our goal is to dominate the natural world, that essentially and effectively is what's happening with much of the corporate world today. And I'm not going to go on some anti-corporate rant like capitalism's the bad guy. You'll never hear me say that because I don't believe that to be the case. But the global economy today functions, whether or not it intends to, functions in this capacity, one of extraction and one of dominance of the natural world. That's largely the way it is set up. And unfortunately, a lot of the kind of racial overtones that come to that still continue to go along with that. And that dominance extends not just to the natural world, but to other marginalized peoples as well. So this has tended to be a common theme, and we still see this echoed today. Another theme that we've seen at various points throughout human history, this idea of romanticism. It's really emerged in the 18th and 19th century. Paintings like this from Frederick Church, or writings like Walden from Thoreau. But we see this in many other stages as well, this idea of romanticizing the natural world, not almost, but even to the extent of sort of idealizing it to an unrealistic degree as well, has been another perspective. A few modern perspectives on environmental stewardship. So these are a variety of different ways of sort of pro-environmental thinking that I think are helpful for understanding here at the outset of our course as well. And we're going to hit just briefly on each of these. First being this idea of preservation. Again, going back to John Muir, this is encapsulated in his work better than probably anyone else who you see pictured here, with Theodore Roosevelt, who is the great champion of national parks and setting aside natural places in the United States. But after this sort of era of technological dominance really began to emerge in a major way, sort of following on the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people realized there's a real threat to many of the natural wonders around the world. So people like Muir and Roosevelt really stepped up to try to protect a lot of other wild places. And it's a good thing they did, because without that effort of trying to preserve many of these places in the early 20th century, then we would have lost a lot of them as well. So, you see writings like this quote from John Muir here, where it really, again, focuses on kind of this romantic perspective of the world, but focusing on protecting and preserving and keeping things in place as they are, lest we lose them. Similar to the preservation movement, or happening at the similar time, I should say, but not focused on setting things aside. So whereas preservation was focused on keeping things as they are, protected, natural, pristine, the conservation movement, in contrast, was focused on sustainable utilization of natural places. So this is exhibited in the life of Gifford Pinchot. He was the first head of the US Forest Service. So Pinchot saw the natural world, natural resources, as being fundamental to human society, which of course they are, but the need to protect them, not from preserving them and keeping them natural, but protect them for continued use in future generations. So this idea of sustainability, that we need to protect these resources for future generations so that they can also use them, not enjoy them in their natural condition, but use them for resources in the future. So we have to sustain that. Wise use is a phrase that frequently is associated with the conservation movement and with Pinchot, this idea that we are going to use these resources. Muir would say, let's not use them. Let's keep them natural and pristine and protect them, because there's an inherent spiritual and aesthetic and recreational value to them existing. Pinchot would say, we need to use them. Some of that's going to be recreational use, but some of that's going to be harvesting and extraction use. But we need to do so in a way that is sustainable. So these often are contrasted together. They really didn't like each other because they had fundamentally different worldviews. And these two individuals, Pinchot and Muir, are really contrasted in their approach to what approach to the environment might look like. Conservation movement, again, focuses on economic and recreational value as opposed to ecological value or aesthetic value or spiritual value, you might say. The conservation movement is focused on active management, actively working and managing the land, as opposed to active protection in the preservation movement. The U.S. Forest Service is an example of the conservation movement. For U.S. Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture because it's a commodity in a sense. How do we manage our forests so that we can use them and utilize them for timber and other purposes, as opposed to our national parks, which we don't use for timber. We don't manage them. We protect them. We set them aside for that aesthetic or recreational use, not for management. Conservation will say it has, these items have instrumental value. We're not protecting them because they have a natural God-given value to them. We're protecting them because they are valuable to us. Preservation movements say there is inherent value. You could say God-given value or natural value to them as well. So those are two different, conservation versus preservation, both pro-sustainable protection of the natural world, but with very different purposes in mind. And that's an important distinction to understand, one versus the other. Just briefly, two more. Sustainable development. Sustainable development, which we'll talk about later in this course, focuses on meeting the needs of the present without jeopardizing our ability to meet the needs of future generations. In other words, economic growth is a necessity because there are many people still in poverty, because those who aren't, and because all of us, including those who aren't in poverty, want to continue to maintain a high standard of living. So economic growth is fundamentally important. In other words, development is fundamentally important, but we have to do so in a way that meets both our needs and the needs of future generations. We can't mortgage the planet in order to meet our short-term desires right now. That's the idea of sustainable development. There's a number of sustainable development goals, and it looks at the intersection of not just caring for the planet, but how do we care for the planet while addressing poverty, while providing for jobs and addressing issues of inequality and education? How does all that merge together so that we're addressing these development challenges, but in a way that protects the planet at the same time? That's the idea behind sustainable development. Last topic for today, we will also talk more about this later at multiple points throughout the course. Environmental justice is that intersection between environmental concerns and social justice concerns. So frequently what we find is that the peoples who are most directly impacted by environmental problems tend to be people of color. They tend to be people who are marginalized in some capacity. They tend to be lower income individuals. These are often referred to as frontline communities, communities who are most adversely impacted by environmental degradation. And so environmental justice says, hey, this is one of the most important environmental issues out there. The fact that people who are already marginalized in society are the ones most directly impacted by the environmental problems that we see today. And often those people have done the least to contribute to those problems that we see today. So that's what environmental justice looks at, and we'll explore that more as well. All right, that's it for today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the first lecture. See you on future ones.